Number 9. Kelly Sue Park. In 2008, up-and-coming model and actress Juliana Redding had recently scored one of her first major shoots with Maxim magazine when she was beaten and strangled to death in her Los Angeles home. Detectives theorized that the 21-year-old was targeted over some alleged bad business dealings involving her father, who was a pharmacist, and her ex-boyfriend, Dr. Munir Ueda. She had managed to dial 911 as she fought for her life, but was dead by the time police arrived. The apartment was a disaster, and the evidence left behind was gruesome. Detectives connected DNA found at the scene to one of Dr. Ueda's employees, Kelly Sue Park. Prosecutors accused Ueda of hiring Park to intimidate and harass his enemies. They charged Park with murder, but they hit a snag when the judge ruled that they couldn't present any evidence relating to their allegations that Park was an enforcer for Ueda. The decision severely weakened the case, which only fell apart more when a DNA expert testified that the defendant's DNA could have been transferred to the scene by the actual killer when they wiped down their fingerprints. Park, who maintained her innocence all along, was acquitted of all charges. She graced news headlines once again in 2015 when she was accused of fraud in yet another case involving her employer, Dr. Ueda. The allegations were connected to the alleged shady business transactions that Ueda had been involved in with Jennings' father. Park lucked out once more when the charges were dropped because the prosecutor missed a deadline for a preliminary hearing. While some continue to suspect that she may not be as innocent as she claimed to be in both the fraud and murder cases, she got to walk away after her accusers failed to present solid and convincing arguments against her. Number 8. Jonathan Gordon. One day in 2019, a man left his home in Merseyside, England, and was ambushed by an attacker who threw acid in his face. The victim was left with disfiguring scars and was temporarily blinded, but he caught a good enough glimpse of the perpetrator to pick him out in a lineup. He identified 34-year-old Liverpool resident Jonathan Gordon as the culprit. An investigation found that Gordon was a member of a gang called the Delhi Mob. He committed the attack after receiving instructions from one of his superiors and was paid thousands of dollars to get the job done. Detectives uncovered evidence that he also had plans to carry out 2 other attacks, but his attempts were thwarted by police, home surveillance cameras, and a fear of getting caught. Gordon was convicted of numerous charges and received a life sentence with a minimum of 24 years. 2 accomplices, 28-year-old Stephen Wissett and 27-year-old Dylan Johnson, were also found guilty on several counts. Wissett was sentenced to 12.5 years in prison, while Johnson was ordered to spend 18 years behind bars. Number 7. Bronson Lizard Man Ellery. Bronson Ellery had a reputation for being tough. Nicknamed Lizard Man for the tattoos that covered his face and body, he was an enforcer for the Bandito biker gang in Gold Coast, Australia. And it was certainly true that he had a capacity to commit horrific violence. His girlfriend, 20-year-old Chelsea Schilling, learned this the hard way in 2016 when Ellery murdered her at his apartment. But by the time Ellery's best friend, Michael Ryan Warburton, arrived at the scene, the career criminal was in the middle of an emotional breakdown, and Schilling's body was on the floor in a pool of blood. Warburton later testified in court that he held Ellery for about an hour before the distraught 24-year-old said, "I promised her I'd go with her," and took a lethal cocktail of drugs. Police arrested him weeks after the murder, after realizing that he had lied about his identity at the scene. In addition to the criminal charges that Warburton faced, many wondered why he didn't try to stop Ellery from taking his own life. Warburton's attorney, James McNabb, argued that Ellery was inconsolable and that there was nothing his client could have done to prevent the suicide. He was jailed for 2 years for giving a false name to police and for drug possession. Number 6. Tariq Zahed. In 2014, an off-duty doctor encountered a shocking sight in Sydney, Australia. A man had been stabbed in the head, shot in the thigh, and left for dead just outside a hospital. Unfortunately, by the time he was found, it was too late to save his life. Police identified him as 29-year-old Youssef Assoum and concluded that his murder was gang-related. An arrest finally came in 2022 when an enforcer of the nationwide Comancheros biker gang was charged in connection with the case. The suspect, 42-year-old Tariq Zahed, had recently been shot 10 times in an unrelated incident when he was taken into custody with bandages still on his head. Police apprehended Zahed in a dramatic traffic stop, during which officers shot beanbag pellets at the man's BMW, leaving some of the vehicle's windows busted. A law enforcement spokesperson later explained that the arrest was considered high risk because of the suspect's deep gang affiliations and criminal lifestyle. When authorities learned that Zahed planned to travel to Sydney from Melbourne for an event, they seized the opportunity to finally get him off the streets. Zahed expected to be released on bail shortly after the arrest, but his application was denied and a judge ordered for him to remain behind bars. His brother and another suspect have also been charged in connection with Assoum's murder. Number 5. Teen tensions escalate. One day in 2021, a group of 5 teens armed with machetes chased down a mentally and physically disabled young man named Levi Ernest Morrison in the English suburb of Sydenham and viciously stabbed him to death. The fatal attack took just 30 seconds before the gang hopped into a waiting getaway car and sped away. Detectives concluded, based on social media and cell phone evidence, that the victim and suspects were entangled in a gang rivalry at the time of the murder. The killers had relied on one of the suspects' mothers, Nicola Layton, to drive them to and from the scene. Layton told police that the victim and his friends had kept knocking on her front door in search of her son, Tyrese Ulysses. She had even called the cops shortly before the murder and told them that if Ernest Morrison's group returned, she would batter them. When Ulysses found out that the youths were bothering his mother, he rounded up his own reinforcements and went after them. They caught up with Ernest Morrison in an alleyway where they took no mercy on the autistic teen, who also had a drop foot and relied on a crutch to walk. Layton admitted driving the group to the scene, but claimed that she didn't know they were armed. She said that she thought her son and his friends meant to scare the group off and was unaware of their violent plans. A jury convicted Layton and 2 unnamed suspects of murder. Ulysses was found guilty of manslaughter, and the trial of 1 other suspect ended in a hung jury. Layton is serving a life sentence with a minimum of 23 years, while Ulysses received a 13-year sentence. The 2 teens who were convicted of murder received life sentences with minimums of 16 and 20 years, and the suspect, whose trial ended in a hung jury, was sentenced to 6 years on a weapons charge. Number 4. Pierre Aragon. In the early morning hours of July 22, 2012, Fernando Fernandez of the Greater Toronto Area's Woodbridge Loners Motorcycle Club was beaten to death with baseball bats. Fernandez was left with a brain injury, and he was also intoxicated at the time of the assault, so he was unable to identify his attackers. He received 60 stitches for his injuries and had a metal plate inserted into his arm. Detectives eventually identified their main suspect as Pierre Aragon, an enforcer for the Bandidos Motorcycle Club. They found evidence that he had accidentally butt-dialed someone during the attack, and that the person who answered on the other end heard the beating going on. Aragon's DNA was also found on the assault weapon. In addition to working for the Bandidos, he had previously been an enforcer for the Loners, who were entangled in an internal dispute when Fernandez was beaten. Aragon was found guilty of the crime, which came on the heels of another conviction for aggravated assault stemming from a gang-related killing in 2005. He was also found guilty of the assault against Fernandez and filed numerous lawsuits to try challenging his sentence and imprisonment. In 2022, Aragon won a new sentencing hearing, which has yet to happen, but his convictions still stand. Number 3. Matthew Palacios. The infamous Latin Kings gang has thousands of members across the United States. They have a highly organized hierarchy and a sophisticated system of going about their illicit activities. Most of their revenue comes from illegal drug sales, and they're notorious for the violence they commit against rivals and witnesses. Matthew Palacios was a member of the gang's Boston-based Devon Street Kings chapter, and he had no problem living up to the Latin King's reputation in his role as an enforcer. His job was to plan attacks against rival gangs, to go after suspected rats, and to punish members when they broke the rules. And while the Latin Kings are extremely careful about who they let into their world, undercover detectives still manage to gather intel. During the investigation, they captured video footage of Palacios discussing illicit racketeering activities and committing brutal acts of violence to discipline members. He was also caught on tape discussing planned attacks against the gang's enemies. In 2019, federal authorities charged 62 high-ranking members of the Latin Kings with racketeering, conspiracy, drug conspiracy, and weapons offenses. Palacios was the 11th defendant to be sentenced in the case in early 2021. He pleaded guilty to racketeering under the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations, or RICO Act, and received a 33-month prison sentence, followed by 3 years of probation. Number 2. Jerry Tillinghast. Gerald Tillinghast worked as a career criminal during the 1960s and 70s as an enforcer for the mafia-affiliated Patriarca crime family in Rhode Island. In addition to upholding the mob's authority, he dabbled in other crimes. In 1975, Tillinghast was accused of participating in the famed bonded vault heist in Providence, which saw the theft of tens of millions of dollars worth of valuables from a safe deposit business. It was one of the biggest robberies in U.S. history and the largest in Rhode Island's history. Tillinghast would later be acquitted of all charges in connection with the incident, but by then he had been convicted of other, equally serious offenses. In 1978, mob loan shark George Basmagian was shot dead. Police soon zeroed in on Tillinghast and his brother Harold as their prime suspects. After firing 6 bullets into the victim, Jerry Tillinghast reloaded the gun and shot Basmagian 3 more times to make sure he was dead. Both brothers were convicted and received life sentences, but they continued to maintain their innocence. Jerry continued his gangster life from behind bars. Shortly after being transferred to a prison in New Jersey during the 90s, he was arrested for running illegal sports betting operations from his jail cell. The gambling took place on the outside, but Tillinghast was the brains behind it and had 5 years tacked onto his prison sentence for it. He spent nearly 30 years in prison, but managed to avoid staying there for the rest of his life. In 2007, Tillinghast was paroled under strict terms, including an ankle monitoring bracelet that tracked his whereabouts at all times. He was also required to work, despite being on home arrest. In a 2018 interview with Providence news station WJAR, Tillinghast expressed remorse for his past. He said that crime don't pay, and that by living that kind of lifestyle, you lose everything you had going for you. He described imprisonment as counting bricks on a wall, while asking oneself if their actions were worth it. In other words, Tillinghast had had a lot of time to think about what he'd done, and he walked out of prison a changed man. He passed away in 2022. Number 1. Renato Gino GIOE. In recent years, a federal investigation of the New York-based Gambino crime family led authorities to suspects near and far. The probe was undertaken based on suspicions revolving around the business practices of PARRE Funding, one of the largest cash advance lenders in the U.S. In 2020, a 54-year-old Miramar, Florida resident and bodybuilder, Renato Gino GIOE, became the first suspect to be charged in connection with the case. Prosecutors have accused him of acting as an enforcer for the Philadelphia-based lending company, which provided struggling businesses with quick, high-interest loans. When clients failed to pay on their debts, GIOE allegedly threatened them with violence, harassed them, and used other mafia-style extortion tactics to get the message across that missing payments would not be tolerated. According to court documents, GIOE traveled all around the country to deliver messages to victims. He threatened to stick a fork in one debtor's head and warned another borrower that he would chop their hands off if they failed to get current with their loan. In one disturbing encounter, GIOE cautioned a Los Angeles businessman about a past borrower who had failed to pay up and ended up dying in what he described as a suspicious car accident. Throughout the course of the investigation, detectives found evidence that the wise guy also threatened borrowers' families. They identified at least 7 victims who were all targeted at various points throughout a 7-year span. GIOE pleaded guilty to the charges he faced in connection with the case. It's unclear whether he cooperated with authorities, who have since set their sights on bigger fish, including the company's owner, Joseph Laforte, or if there's a plea deal involved. Thanks for watching. Would you rather live next to a family that you're convinced is in the mob but who are respectful towards you, or next to a hoarder whose junk spills into your lawn? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.